Hi, this is John Harcher. Welcome to episode 42 of Keep On Grooving. So we're going to give this a try, the whole Royal Albert Hall situation. We'll start at the beginning and work our way through to today and see if we can make heads or tails of it all. Episode 42, Hendrix at Royal Albert Hall, 55 years later. Okay, let's see what we can do with this. It's really hard to make sense of this whole thing. At one point, one side wanted one thing and the other wanted something different, and that happens. But after you start reaching 20, 30, 40, then 50 years, you'd think whatever issues were separating the sides would go away, for lack of a better term. But not in this case, and we're still not exactly sure why. I even got a hold of longtime Hendrix scholars, and they were perplexed. Purple Jim has a page on his site on the whole situation, and he gave me some good info on some of the lawsuits, but even he wasn't sure about parts of it. I asked author Frank Moriarty if I'd missed anything in his Modern Listener's Guide to Jimi Hendrix, and he said he didn't want to go near it with a 10-foot pole, so he just talked about the records. I'll be using Jim's page, Frank's book, and a few bits from the Setting the Record Straight book by John McDermott and Eddie Kramer to try to cobble this together. Thanks in advance to them for the help. So we'll just go chronologically, talk about what actually has made it out from the shows and the legal issues blocking its full release. Let's go back to last episode. Experience records 2 shows at Royal Albert Hall in February 1969, the second of which was far better to use for a film and album. Filmmakers Steve Gold and Jerry Goldstein also had footage from the European tour in January, as well as some other casual moments. Time to put the film together. The next time we outsiders hear about it is via a moment backstage at the Isle of Wight show, where Jerry Stickles lets Jimmy know there's some kind of delay with the Royal Albert Hall release. Little did they know. Now, as we know from our bootlegs and what pops up on the internet, the film was completed. It runs about an hour and 15 minutes or so, contains an abbreviated show on the 24th, concentrating mostly on the back half of it. At some point, Mike Jeffrey saw the film and reportedly didn't like it. He disliked it so much he made sure Warner Brothers got involved to make sure it didn't get released. In all honesty, it's not really that different from Jimmy Plays Berkeley, which Jeffrey okayed to be released. The big question appears to be exactly when this supposed showing was. Was it before Jimmy died or after? If it was before, it would help explain Jimmy and Jerry's conversation and the delay. If that was the main issue, it would appear to have a simple answer. Re-edit the film. But we don't know if that was it. Then Jimmy dies, they get Cry of Love out, and then have a number of other things on their plate. Before they could get their second release out, an album pops up over the summer of 1971 on Ember Records entitled Experience by Jimi Hendrix. This must have come as a bit of a surprise. The liner notes said the album was recorded on February 18th, but it was actually from the 24th. It wasn't long, barely half an hour, with only 2 songs on each side. Side 1 had Sunshine of Your Love and the long jam on Roomful of Mirrors. Side 2 had Bleeding Heart and the finale entitled Smashing of the Amps. It was clear they didn't use the actual professionally recorded multi-track tapes. Likely what they did is took the sound right off of the film and used that. But as it turns out, the record is the first live album to be released after Jimmy's death. This must not have sat well with Mike Jeffrey. They were putting their own live album together from various shows from 1969 and 1970. You almost wonder if they rushed out the Isle of Wight album on Polydor to counter this in some way, but there's no evidence to back that up. But Eddie Kramer and John Jansen were diligently looking for solid performances to put out. One day, Mike walks in and drops a bunch of tapes on the desk and tells Kramer and Jansen to use them. Apparently, it was well known enough that there was some issue regarding the Royal Albert Hall material. So the guys asked, Mike, what are these? Jeffrey replied, oh, it's okay, everything's fine, go ahead and use them. One would wonder if everything was fine when In the West came out early in 1872, Little Wing and Voodoo Child were noted to have come from San Diego and not Royal Albert Hall. They sounded a whole lot better than what was on the Ember albums, so these were definitely from the multi-tracks. The other side answered in a couple of ways. First, they released another Royal Albert Hall album, this one imaginally titled More Experience. It started out with the two songs the Hendrix people used on In the West, though for some odd reason, Little Wing was called Little Ivy. This was followed by Voodoo Child and then into Room Full of Mirrors, just like it was in the show. But wasn't that on last album? Indeed it was. They put out an edited version on the end of side 1. Side 2 started out with the Purple Haze Wild Thing medley that led into Smashing of the Amps from the next album, but we didn't get an edited version of that here. Instead, we get an edited version of Bleeding Heart. The movie had Loverman, I Don't Live Today, and Foxy Lady in full. Wonder why they didn't use those instead. Oh, and the second response was another lawsuit, this time with Eddie and John tossed in. In the mid-70s, the switchover happened after Jeffrey's passing to Alan Douglas for the rest of the decade. They didn't do anything with the Royal Albert Hall material. Heck, he'd even pulled In the West from the catalog in the US. Another label ended up putting out the Ember albums sort of mashed up in one, just without Smashing of the Amps. But by the early 80s, someone thought something must have changed. While compiling what would become the Jimi Hendrix concerts in 1982, Douglas picked two songs from Royal Albert Hall, the extended version of Stone Free, complete with the Blast from the Past intro, but missing a bit of the drum solo, and Bleeding Heart, trimmed by about a minute. But they were mistaken. A lawsuit was soon filed over the use of the tracks once more. However, the result of this action did not end with the album being pulled. It remained available as is, or with a bonus track, for the next decade. Speaking of, let's leap forward to the year that CD with the bonus track came out, 1989. This was the year I had 4 touchstones with the Royal Albert Hall material. First was the album I just mentioned, Jimi Hendrix Concert. I ordered it on an LP from the Columbia House Record Club. Later that year, I got the CD when it came out. I also picked up a CD from the cheapie bin called Experience. It had the cover from the first Ember album. It had the entire contents of those 2 records, basically in the order they appeared on those albums. So it had things like the Little Ivy name difference and both edited versions at the end. I had to piece together Purple Haze Wild Thing and Smashing of the Amps, onto a cassette so it would play correctly. The third one was Red House from Royal Albert Hall that turned up on the Hal Leonard guitar lesson series entitled Variations on a Theme Red House. We talked about that in an earlier episode. It had 7 versions of Red House to show how the song could be performed differently each time. Now, from what I remember, this release did not trigger some kind of lawsuit to stop its distribution. Thank heavens for small favors. My final Royal Albert Hall touchstone is the big one. I mentioned my trip to my buddy David's down in Little Rock in summer 1989, how I picked up a lot of Hendrix stuff. One of them was in a record store that carried unofficial material. One of those offerings was a videotape of the film Experience. It wasn't completely unreasonably priced, maybe $20-25. So I swiped it up and we popped it into the VCR. Quality wasn't great, and as I mentioned before, the tape ran right out, like towards the end of Wild Thing, but you got the basic idea. Plus, nowadays, the music parts of the movie are a whole lot easier to find, so I've now seen the end. Now, if you don't go telling everybody, I'll let you know what's in the movie we're not supposed to have seen. The film opens with a very psychedelic version of Stone Free, with images crisscrossing over one another and the crowd bopping back and forth. A lot of bright lights, too. There's a lot of real markings where other films should go. Would be nice to see Jimi Hendrix in a Jimi Hendrix movie, but we hear him. Now, we know from concert Stone Free was over 10 minutes long, but this is an edited version that runs about 5. Then the lights come up and we see Jimi and the band. Boy, those white boots funky. Woo! The film basically cuts between a wide shot of the band from the back of the audience and a camera focusing in on Jimi from right in front of Mitch. You can actually see the guy in the wide shots. Loverman is next, the longer 1969 version, as we noted last episode. Towards the middle of the song, we get one more camera angle, this one right off next to Noel pointing in Jimmy's direction. They skip over to I Don't Live Today, not quite catching all of Jimmy's intro. When we get to the solo section, we get a little light show before cutting back to the band. Some of the video doesn't match up with the sound, so there must have been some kind of edit. Not sure why. The rest of the song is basically uncut, though a bit may have gotten trimmed off the end. Then it's the behind-the-scenes stuff at the apartment where they're hanging out for a minute or two. After that, it's back to the hall and midway through the intro of Bleeding Heart. But after that, it's basically the rest of the song. Fire is next. For some reason, they intercut it with some dude shimmying up in the balcony. Lots of fast cuts at the end. Hey, it was the 60s. Then back to the apartment and Jimmy doing Hound Dog on the acoustic guitar with the Two Old Maids lyric before he stops and can't remember the rest of the words. Foxy Lady is next, and it could have been such a game changer had it come out at the time to see Jimmy doing his thing. But then he moves into the blues again, and Hear My Train A-Comin'. There's a lot of intercutting with Jimmy at the airport. Not sure which one. They cut out most of the solo, do the second verse, then edit the ending down. Most of the footage we get is from the cars driving through town. Again, not sure which one. I didn't see any iconic landmarks, so it could have been any show they recorded since the end of January. They look to be driving on the right, so it's not England. Then it's Little Wing after that, and for some reason at the beginning of the song they have this image of the ocean over top of Jimmy as he's doing the first verse. And, I don't know why. But then towards the end of the song it just gets kind of normal and we just see the band playing. So thank God for that. They go right into Voodoo Child after that, get through the first verse, and all of a sudden there's a sparkler right in the middle of the screen. And it doesn't go away until the solo is over and they head back into the second verse. And it comes back at the end of the verse. But we do get practically the whole song. Jimmy scratching at the end give the roadies time to set up the jam session with Rocky on congas, Chris Wood and Dave Mason on Room Full of Mirrors. They basically show the whole thing just with wide shots and the occasional close-up. And instead of editing a lot of the dead time between the end of the show and the encore, we get the whole minute and a half where nothing happens except a kid running on stage. We get the muffled sounding Purple Haze, which goes right into the Out of Tune Wild Thing and ends with the smashing of the amps, which I had to see online. So let's now jump ahead to the mid-90s. The catalog moves over to MCA. Douglas does his final few albums and leaves, and the family comes in with Experience Hendrix. Their mission at the time was to put the catalog back together in a semi-coherent fashion. We talked about that in an earlier episode as well. Monterey was a little late. It probably should have been out in 2001 instead of 2007. But overall, they generally got things going in the right direction, quills aside. One thing I didn't know is they were looking at this piece of the puzzle way earlier than I thought. I got a little tidbit from Hendrix expert and vinyl aficionado extraordinaire, Gordon Johnson, that Experience Hendrix was looking to do a Royal Albert Hall release maybe as early as the 90s. Considering they took over in 95, got their first two albums out in 97, we'd likely be looking at 98 or 99. Maybe this would have been in place of the Band of Gypsys album. In any case, we didn't get it. However, we did get probably the most cleaned up version of the tracks that appeared on In the West when Little Wing and Voodoo Child showed up on the 2000 box set, aka the Purple Box. It didn't make much of an impression regarding the Royal Albert Hall release at a time, since they had appeared previously. This would change a decade later. So apart from rumblings here and there, nothing outwardly changed regarding the project status, at least officially. However, there was one major release which showed off the possibilities of what could be done with the material. Without going into too much detail, supposedly one of the lawyers for the Steve Gold, Jerry Goldstein end of the situation, who'd worked with Jimmy's friend Eric Burden as well, thought he'd been able to license the right to the material to other labels. He did so to Charlie Records, which, as we've mentioned, was a smaller label that focused on relicensing things like blues records. For the longest time, they were the only one to have a digital version of the Howlin' Wolf tracks from the London Revisited album until MCA put out their deluxe London session set. Charlie then put out a number of releases over the years featuring honest-to-God unreleased songs from Royal Albert Hall. Well, not all of the releases. I bought one version which had the correct songs listed in the correct order but substituted previously released ones instead of the Royal Albert Hall versions, Like they had Hear My Train a Comin' from Winterland, Foxy Lady from LA, and that kind of thing. But eventually they got the 2-disc set right, which led to their pièce de résistance, a 3 CD set containing the full actual set from Royal Albert Hall, some of the afternoon rehearsals we spoke about, plus a bootleg of the February 18th show. Now, this was sort of something you and your friends could have done with 90-minute cassettes if you had enough of the bootlegs, but it showed the promise of what could be once everyone got on the same page. Then on September 10th, 2006, the Sunday Times of London was raising its prices up 20 pence to an even £2. But to make it special for their readers, they gave them something extra. They included a CD of Jimi Hendrix at Royal Albert Hall with 10 tracks. But 10 odd tracks. First, they didn't do them in any concert order. The first 3 did run in the order they were played at the show: Little Wing, Voodoo Child, and Roomful of Mirrors. Then they did Fire, which was just before those 3, and actually would have been a good opener for the CD. Then they jumped back to after those first 3 to do Purple Haze and Wild Thing, but not Smashing of the Amps. They then did Bleeding Heart and Sunshine of Your Love. These exhausted the previously released Ember tracks. However, instead of going with Red House or Stone Free, they selected 2 previously unreleased tracks. The first was Hey Joe, but they didn't do Hey Joe at either show. However, they did do it at the afternoon rehearsal, so this was the full one. Then they finished the CD with Foxy Lady from the 24th. So this was a big surprise, especially for Experience Hendrix and the last Experience, the Goldstein Company. They were completely blindsided. Once both of them were sure the other had nothing to do with it, they both brought the Sunday Times to court. It appears the newspaper subleased the tracks from Charlie, who thought they were good to do it. Obviously not. In 2010, the Sunday Times were forced to pay out for this release under the idea that it undermined any future release the other 2 companies had in mind. You'd hope that this would have led to a mending of fences, with both companies seeing their window was closing and they needed to get on the ball with this. That's, of course, not what happened. There is an article from 2010 regarding the Sunday Times lawsuit where Jimi Hendrix mentioned there is a 106-minute print of a Royal Albert Hall film, not necessarily ready to go, but at least assembled. When the switch over to Sony happened, suffice it to say something was discussed regarding a release, and it didn't work out. In fact, it resulted in another lawsuit. It appears Sony offered to do some kind of very limited release of the film, but it was rejected by the filmmakers. They wanted a wide release like any other movie. Experience Hendrix thought this amounted to a breach of contract and sued, which resulted in a countersuit. All this happened right around the time Experience Hendrix was looking to do a reissue of In the West. No one knows exactly why, but it's assumed they didn't want to take any chances, so they swapped out Little Wing and Voodoo Child for different versions. However, those 2 Royal Albert Hall tracks still remained on the purple box, were on the 2013 reissue, and are still there to this day in physical and streaming options. So it was not a court-demanded option. They just kind of did it on their own. That 2011 lawsuit took 6 years to get resolved and not Experience Hendrix's favor. The court ruled the filmmakers did not break the contract when they rejected the limited release option. However, Sony Experience Hendrix were not ordered to do the wide release option either. So after a lot of money changed hands, things were no different from where we were before this. Now, there were rumbles that Experience Hendrix was going to try to do something anyway. In fact, it seems for certain in 2016, at the very least, a video was prepared, but nothing came out. Whether or not this had any resemblance to the 2010 edit, we have no idea. Pure speculation on my part. This may have been slated towards the end of the year in 2016, and then when it didn't work out, they quickly swapped in the first Band of Gypsies show, Machine Gun, to kind of fill its space. They may have even had an idea of doing Songs for Groovy Children back then, but they just we needed a release, so they put Machine Gun out. Then, as we discussed in an earlier episode, came those glorious 3 days in October 2019, where on the 1st we got word that Songs for Groovy Children was coming out. Then 2 days later, on the 3rd, it was announced the Royal Albert Hall film would be shown at Royal Albert Hall on October 21st, for one time only. Everyone wondered which film would it be. It was unlikely they'd be showing the old one, but what would the new one look like? When the day did come, those lucky folks in London got to see an introduction by Jimi Hendrix and Jerry Goldstein, seeming chummy as could be. Then once the film got going, the most interesting part right off the bat was there were no opening credits, meaning this was still a work in progress. From reports, the film showed the following songs in this order. It opened with Stone Free, then went into Loverman, I Don't Live Today, Red House, Foxy Lady, Fire, Little Wing, Voodoo Child, Roomful of Mirrors, Purple Haze, Wild Thing, and the Smashing of the Amps finale. Hear My Train A-Comin' and Sunshine of Love did not appear in the film, and Bleeding Heart was shown in a playback of the rehearsal version. There was also some rare footage of Jimmy playing at the Speakeasy Club on February 25th. It ended with Jimmy playing Hound Dog on the acoustic down in the bottom corner of the screen, meaning it would be playing as the final credits roll. So this was a little closer to the show's actual set list. They stated at the time this would be a one-time only showing, and as of now, they're still correct. Not only has it not been released, I've honestly almost never seen a leak of the footage at all. I think I saw one guy's smartphone camera shot video, but it wasn't up for long. From all reports, the footage looked terrific, a major upgrade from the versions floating around out there of the original film. There was also an upgrade of the February 18th audio source. The old bootleg was supplanted by a soundboard version, and yeah, it sounds way better. It's out there for you to hear, so at the moment, it doesn't look like they'll be released anytime soon. Apparently, what this one-time showing was just to extend the copyright before it expired because of the 50-year thing, I think, in the EU. So where do we stand now? Sadly, I'd say no different than where we've been over the past 55 years. It's not known if Goldstein still wants a wide release for the film. Word of advice, if you do, pony up the funds and have it introduced by Taylor Swift and Beyonce. That'll be the only way you can make sure people will make the effort to go to the theater and see it. Otherwise, streaming would seem to be the way to go. You could put it together with the Electric Lady studio video and... oh yeah, we're still waiting on that one too. Oh well, maybe someday. Once again, thanks to Jim, Frank, Gordon, and JHM over at the Hoffman Boards, a.k.a. Jeff, for their help in putting all this together. Next time, provided we don't get a surprise announcement, we'll do our look at Jimmy's friends in the band Traffic. Hard to believe they're the other band who most closely worked with Jimmy, but that's what it is. We'll start off taking a look at the four original members and their first few albums and their first break, which actually crossed paths with Jimmy at Royal Albert Hall. That's next time I Keep On Grooving. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Hartruck. Thanks for listening.